The little boy stood alone at the edge of the highway, his tiny hands trembling as he waved down a thunderous line of motorcycles cutting through the evening mist. The roar of the engines shook the silent street, and for a moment it looked as if the riders would pass him by like everyone else had that day. But then the lead biker slowed, his black helmet turning toward the child, whose face was streaked with tears and dust, whose eyes held a fear far too old for someone so small. There was something in that look, something desperate, something broken, that made every rider behind him squeeze their brakes. In seconds, the road that had felt so vast and uncaring was filled with the deep growl of idling bikes and the shadows of leather-clad strangers. The boy's lips quivered as he asked for directions to the police station, and none of them were prepared for the reason why. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of strangers becoming family, please take a moment to like this video, comment your thoughts, share it with someone who believes in humanity, and subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching stories. The boy's name was Adam, and he was only 8 years old. He was smaller than most children his age, thin in a way that spoke of too many missed meals and too many sleepless nights. His faded blue shirt hung loosely from his shoulders, and one of his shoes had a torn sole that flapped every time he took a step. He had been walking for nearly an hour, moving farther from the small, cracked house at the end of Maple Street where he lived with his mother. The sun was sinking fast, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, and Adam knew darkness was coming. But fear of the night was nothing compared to the fear that had driven him out of his home. The lead biker, a broad-shouldered man everyone in the group called Mason, removed his helmet slowly. His face was rugged, marked by years of wind and hardship, but his eyes softened the moment he looked at Adam. Behind him, the other bikers killed their engines one by one, and an unusual silence fell over the road. The little boy swallowed hard and asked again where the police station was. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet every word carried the weight of panic. Mason knelt so he was eye level with Adam, sensing that this was no ordinary question from a lost child. There was a raw terror in Adam's eyes, the kind that comes from witnessing something no child should ever see. He gently asked why Adam needed the police. At first, the boy hesitated. His fingers tightened around the frayed strap of his tiny backpack. Then, with tears spilling down his cheeks, he admitted that his mother was in trouble. Those words hit the group like a storm. Adam explained in broken pieces, his breath catching between sobs. His mother, Elena, had been sick for weeks. She worked long hours cleaning offices downtown, often returning home late at night exhausted and coughing. But recently, things had gotten worse. The landlord had been threatening them because they were behind on rent, and earlier that afternoon, a man had come to the house demanding money. Adam had hidden behind the cracked kitchen door as he listened to the shouting. He heard the man's angry voice, his mother pleading, then the terrifying sound of something crashing to the floor. After that came silence. Too much silence. When Adam had stepped out, he found his mother lying unconscious near the table, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. The man was gone. The house phone had been disconnected weeks ago. Their nearest neighbors were away. In his mind, there was only one solution: find the police station. The bikers exchanged grim looks. Without another word, Mason stood up and put his helmet back on. He asked Adam where he lived. The boy pointed down the road, toward the older part of town where abandoned homes and broken streetlights lined the streets. Mason looked at the others, and in that single glance a silent decision was made. They weren't going to send him to the police station. They were going with him. The convoy turned around, engines rumbling like distant thunder as Adam was carefully seated in front of Mason on the large motorcycle. The little boy clutched the handlebars with tiny trembling hands, and for the first time that day, he did not feel entirely alone. As the bikes rolled into his street, curtains shifted behind dusty windows. Neighbors who had long stopped paying attention to the suffering around them suddenly stepped outside, drawn by the impossible sight of a biker group escorting a frightened child home. Maple Street was a place forgotten by time. The houses leaned tiredly into one another as if they were the only things keeping themselves standing. Paint peeled from the walls, fences sagged, and the streetlights flickered weakly. Adam's house stood at the very end, its porch steps cracked and uneven. The moment they arrived, Mason rushed inside with two others following close behind. The scene in the kitchen was worse than Adam had described. Alina lay motionless beside the overturned table, pale and breathing shallowly. Blood had dried along her temple. Mason's heart pounded as he checked for a pulse. It was faint, but there. One of the bikers, Carla, who had once worked as a paramedic before life took her down another road, immediately knelt beside Elena. Her hands moved quickly and skillfully, checking for injuries, stabilizing her head, and giving instructions to the others. Another biker called emergency services from his phone, giving the address and demanding immediate assistance. Outside, Adam stood frozen on the porch, watching shadows move through the windows. Every second felt like an hour. The sirens arrived minutes later, slicing through the heavy evening air. Paramedics carried Elena out on a stretcher while Adam clung to Mason's arm, tears silently streaming down his face. Mason looked down at the boy and made a promise he hadn't planned to make. He told him he wasn't alone anymore. At the hospital, the truth began to unravel. Elena had suffered a concussion but was expected to recover. The man who had attacked her was not just a debt collector, as Adam had assumed. He was Victor, Elena's estranged brother, a man who had spiraled into gambling debts and addiction. Desperate for money, he had come to demand the small savings Elena had hidden away for Adam's school fees. When she refused, violence followed. The police took Adam's statement, but it was the bikers who stayed by his side through the long, terrifying night. They bought him food from the hospital vending machine, wrapped him in a spare jacket, and sat with him in the waiting room under the cold fluorescent lights. For Adam, these strangers with tattoos, leather jackets, and booming motorcycles became something he had not known in a very long time: safety. As the hours passed, Mason found himself watching the boy more than the hospital doors. Adam sat curled in the chair, his small hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate, trying so hard not to cry. Mason recognized that look. Years ago, he had worn it himself. Mason had grown up in foster homes, bouncing from one place to another, learning too early that the world could be cruel. The biker club he now led, known as the Iron Souls, had started as a brotherhood for men and women who had survived broken pasts. Many of them had once been homeless, abandoned, or lost. They rode together not just for freedom, but because the road had become the family they never had. That night, Adam unknowingly reminded them all of who they used to be. When Alina finally woke the next morning, the first thing she asked for was her son. The reunion between mother and child was quiet but deeply moving. Adam ran to her bedside and buried his face in her arms, sobbing with the kind of release that comes only after surviving terror. Elena held him tightly despite her pain, tears slipping down her own face as she whispered apologies for the life he had been forced to endure. Mason stood at the doorway, feeling something tighten painfully in his chest. But the story did not end there. When Elena was discharged 2 days later, she returned home only to discover an eviction notice nailed to the front door. Her weeks in the hospital had cost her the cleaning job she depended on. The rent was overdue, and the landlord had no sympathy left. It was the final blow. Adam watched his mother sink onto the porch steps, holding the notice in shaking hands. The look in her eyes was worse than fear. It was defeat. And that was the moment the bikers truly rode up to his street. The next morning, the thunder of engines echoed through Maple Street once more, but this time it brought something no one expected: hope. Dozens of motorcycles lined the road. Men and women stepped off carrying toolboxes, paint cans, groceries, blankets, and boxes of clothes. The Iron Souls had returned, not for a visit, but for a mission. They repaired the broken porch, fixed the leaking roof, repainted the peeling walls, and replaced shattered windows. Carla organized donations from the community. Mason spoke with local businesses and secured Elena a new job at a diner owned by an old friend. Another biker, Daniel, who worked with a legal aid office, helped challenge the eviction notice and arranged emergency housing support. For the first time in years, the house began to feel like a home. Neighbors who had once stayed behind closed curtains slowly emerged to help. An old woman from across the street brought homemade soup. Teenagers from nearby houses helped clean the yard. The presence of the bikers had done more than repair a house. It had awakened a forgotten sense of community. Days turned into weeks. Adam's life changed in ways he could never have imagined. Every Saturday, the bikers visited. Sometimes they brought groceries. Sometimes they simply sat on the porch and shared stories while Adam laughed and played in the yard. Mason taught him how to ride a bicycle. Carla helped him with school assignments. Daniel brought him books and encouraged him to dream beyond the limits of Maple Street. For a boy who had once walked alone toward the police station in fear, the world was slowly becoming a place of warmth. But the deepest transformation happened within Mason. He had spent years believing his purpose was simply to keep moving, to let the road erase the scars of his past. Yet Adam's presence reopened something he thought had long died. The ability to care deeply, to protect, to belong. One rainy evening, months later, Adam stood by the window waiting for the familiar sound of engines. Mason arrived carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a new school backpack, sturdy and bright red, with Adam's name stitched onto the front. The boy's eyes filled with tears. He hugged Mason so tightly that the biker had to blink away his own emotions. Before we reach the ending, if this story is touching your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stories like this remind us that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever. Special request: comment below with the words, "Kindness still lives," if you believe strangers can become angels in someone's darkest moment. A year later, Maple Street looked different. The house at the end of the road had fresh paint, flower pots on the porch, and laughter spilling from the windows. Elena was healthy again, working steady hours and smiling in a way Adam barely remembered from before. The community had come alive, inspired by the bikers who refused to look away. Then came the day that changed everything once more. At Adam's school, students were asked to write an essay about a hero. While others wrote about athletes, movie stars, or superheroes, Adam wrote about a group of bikers who stopped for a little boy on the side of the road. His essay spread through the school, then through the local newspaper, after a teacher submitted it to a writing contest. The story captured hearts across the city. Donations poured in for struggling families in Maple Street. Volunteers came forward. Victor, the man who had attacked Elena, was eventually found and arrested. But the most powerful moment came at the city's annual Community Awards ceremony. The Iron Souls were invited as honored guests. Adam stood on stage, clutching the microphone with trembling hands, his small voice carrying through the silent hall as he told everyone how a group of strangers had saved his mother, his home, and his future. He said that people often judged others by how they looked, but the people who looked the toughest had the kindest hearts he had ever known. There was not a dry eye in the room. Mason, standing among his fellow riders, felt the weight of every mile he had ever traveled, every mistake he had ever made, and every lonely night he had endured. For the first time, all of it seemed to lead to this one moment. Years later, when Adam had grown taller and stronger, when his voice had deepened and his dreams had expanded beyond the narrow streets of his childhood, he still remembered that evening on the highway. He remembered the roar of engines. He remembered the fear. But most of all, he remembered the moment strangers chose kindness. Adam eventually became a police officer. On the day he graduated from the academy, a long line of motorcycles waited outside the gates. The Iron Souls had come, older now but just as proud. Mason stood at the front, his hair touched with gray, his eyes shining with emotion. Adam walked straight to him and embraced the man who had once knelt before a frightened little boy on the roadside. That frightened child had once asked for directions to the police station. Instead, he had been led home, led to healing, led to family, led to purpose. Sometimes, the people we fear at first glance are the very ones sent to save us. Sometimes angels do not arrive with wings. Sometimes they come wrapped in leather jackets, riding machines that shake the earth beneath them. And sometimes, all it takes to change a life is the courage to stop for a child who asks for help. If this story moved your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep stories of hope, compassion, and humanity alive. Never underestimate what one act of kindness can do. It may become the reason someone believes in the world again.